a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years, I've interviewed thousands of veterans.
Oh, give it a rest. You're under new management. It's Pete and Gary's Military History podcast now.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. What we got this week? Well, this week we've got the Battle of Neuve Chapelle from far off 1915. And to help me through the pain and suffering that you'll all be suffering, I've got Gary Bain, my old favourite. Hello, Gary.
Hello, Pete. How are you, you old bastard?
Good Lord, such language. Right, today we're going to do the Battle of Neuve Chapelle. We've got a lot to do, so should we crack on?
Yeah, we'll get on with this today.
Now, so what's happening in early 1915? Well, the French, they've got a few doubts about the British. They were quite impressed by the First Battle of Ypres. They hadn't been impressed by our performance earlier in 1914. They wanted the British to take over more of the front line, so that they could get on with their own offensives. But in the end, Sir John French, who's the British Commander-in-Chief of the BEF, he's pretty willing to get involved, isn't he, Gary?
He is, and ultimately this leads to the Battle of Neuve Chapelle that we're going to talk about, Pete.
Yeah. Now, that had been captured from the British in October 1914, and it would be the first major BEF attack on German entrenched positions, because previous attacks had just been a couple of battalions. Who's doing it? Well, there's First Army's doing it. Now, who's in command of First Army, Gary? Who is it? Which masked man?
Well, it's under one of our favourites, but it's under General Sir Douglas Hague.
And what does the First Army consist of at that time?
Well, it's the 4th Corps and the Indian Corps largely at that time, Pete. Now, interestingly, there's a brigade in the Indian Corps which is selected for part of the initial salutes under the command of Brigadier General Charles Blackadder.
Could that be him?
Could it be him? I think it's actually Blackadder, but
it's going to go on D in, hasn't it?
It did, but it didn't work if I said Blackadder.
Now, why are they keen to attack? Well, the Germans have weakened the Western Front. They've sent a lot of divisions out to the Eastern Front to face those Russians who are now fighting. Oh, the Eastern Front's boiling up, really. And so it's going to be a joint offensive originally, but with the French. But the French drop out because they're already overcommitted. They've been attacking in Artois and Champagne. But the British decide to carry on regardless. Oh, those Carry On films were excellent, weren't they? Which is your favourite, Gary?
Carry On Regardless.
I think that's the worst, personally. I never really liked that one. Anyway, they get ready for the attack. Now, we'll put a map up, or Gary will. I think this could be a job for Gary this time. We'll put a map of Neuve Chapelle up. There's a salient round Neuve Chapelle. And Hague, in charge of First Army, calls for converging attacks. So the 4th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson, another one we come across a lot, and the Indian Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir James Wilcox, one of your favourites, I believe.
You know how to pronounce that, then?
I better get that one right,
yeah.
Or there'll be trouble at Mill. Anyway, the idea is to use massed artillery. They've got a frontage of just 2,000 yards, which is... It really isn't very far, is it? Compare it, for instance, with the Somme, 25,000 yards. And they're going to seize the village, take up defensive positions, and then they launch more attacks, hopefully pushing forward to take the Albers Ridge, which I think you said was...
It's about 4 kilometres to the northeast, Pete.
So 3 miles?
About 4 kilometres.
Yeah, swine. I'm old-fashioned. So that's the object, and Albers Ridge is a long-standing objective throughout 15. Now they've only got enough artillery ammunition, for 3 or 4 days of serious operations. That's all they've got, Gary. So they've got contingency plans where they'd stop at various places if they don't get to the Albers Ridge. This is something people don't understand, that in an offensive you have contingency plans. How would you define the approach Hague takes?
Well, it's broadly collegiate. He consults experts, and he has a number of conferences with these commanders and senior staff charged with carrying out the attack. So his subordinates and their staff officers were expected to work out the details, but there's no doubt that Hague provided insightful guidance.
Yeah. To sum up their guidance, he said, well, he's largely, he works out how to get the troops forward so that people don't notice what's happening. They discuss what they're going to do about their own wire obstacles. The importance of maps will come back to, because this is the first time they use the Royal Flying Corps. They work a lot on how to destroy the barbed wire. They actually work it through and come out with shrapnel. They're going to secretly bring up the gun, register targets. So they practice firing to make sure they can hit it, and then they stop.
So how do they do that without the Germans actually noticing, Pete?
The Germans usually do notice if you register. That's why the great advantage of shooting off the map. But the maps aren't accurate enough, are they? So they can't. They want to locate the Maxim machine guns. They're going to have follow-up artillery. They're using the mountain artillery and machine guns to follow up the assault. They're going to think about mines, and they're going to use saps, and they're going to use trench mortars. It's all new exciting stuff. He really is thinking through, and he's learnt from the French, I think. People always forget that the French have been battering buggery out of the Germans in the Champagne and Artois, and people like Hague have been watching what's going on. So they're all doing that. But the bombardment is key, isn't it? Wouldn't you say, Gary? What's the role of the bombardment in this offensive?
The problems, as you mentioned, for example, barbed wire. So you've got to think about, how you're going to do that. They've practiced with shrapnel and high explosives, and you've got to take care over the troops. One thing you didn't mention was the care of the lives. He is thinking about how to maintain the lives and how artillery can help him.
Yeah. So he's got to. The artillery's got to destroy the German trenches.
Well, it's the heart of his plans, isn't it? Let's face it.
Yeah. They're basically often barricade trenches, because why aren't they normal trenches, Gary?
Because you're up against the Germans, Pete. And
no, it's
yeah. I was going to say, and they know what to expect. They're manning the barricades.
Oh, Gary. It's because if you dig in that area of France, you get up to your arse in water.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in some cases, they've had to use sandbags as well because of the water
building them up
in the area to build them up, yeah.
Now, so they're going to smash them down. They're going to kill the defending garrison. That's a bit harsh, isn't it? Oh, that's supposed to. They are at war. Destroy any machine guns, and then there'd also be a defensive wall, a curtain, no less, of shells to prevent German reinforcements moving forward. We'll see how well that works. And how are they going to achieve that?
Well, you've got to concentrate most of the British batteries on the Western Front in the Neuve Chapelle area. You've mentioned how it's quite a small frontage, but don't forget this is in 1915, Pete. So not only have you got a lack of guns, you've got a lack of shells as well.
That's right. So they bring up the guns. They try and register without the Germans noticing. Well, I don't know about that. But they also draw up a firing programme for each gun. This is all quite new, really. They switch your targets, they time everything, number of rounds to be fired, when to be fired.
That sounds really complex.
Yeah, how do you think that compares to something in 1917 or 1918?
That doesn't compare, does it, really?
That's going to grow out of all recognition. But that's a start. For at the time, everyone was going, "Oh, this is so complex. My head's exploding." And there were artillery officers with their heads exploding all over the place. Now, let's talk. You raised it, and I've raised it, so we both raised it. Let's actually talk about it now. What about barbed wire? So why don't they just blow it up with high explosive? If they had some high explosive shells, mind you, which in itself is a separate issue. Why don't they just blow it up, Gary?
Well, they tried that, hadn't they? And they'd been experimenting. And what happens if you blow something up, Pete? It comes down again.
Is it like what goes up must come down?
Yeah. So whilst it disturbed the barbed wire, it didn't actually cut it. They found that shrapnel did. albeit that it would be small areas of barbed wire. So they were largely reliant on shrapnel dealing with the barbed wire.
And good gunners who could time the fuse detonation so that the shrapnel exploded in the right place, because it's very dependent on skill, isn't it?
Yeah, they had a huge debate, for example, about how long the initial bombardment should be. You know, should it be a sustained bombardment over a period of time or a short hurricane bombardment? You know, just to surprise the Germans, basically. And again, that's important of the future, isn't it? They're experimenting.
We always used to, when I was at university, and I expect when you were in the army, we always used to try and use the word dichotomy. And there is a dichotomy here. If you have a short bombardment, it might not destroy the target, but if you have a long bombardment, the Germans know you're coming. And there is a problem here. And it comes to it's a dichotomy of destruction and suppression and surprise. It's all anyway. That's in 1915. Practical considerations. I think the boss. They need a bombardment they work out of 2.5 hours, but they haven't got the shells, and they decide they can make do with a hurricane bombardment of 35 minutes. And this is very like the bombardments in 1918. It's a quick, powerful bombardment. And that would allow the 18-pounder field guns to clear the wire, while the 4.5 howitzers and, I say heavy artillery, but whatever heavy artillery they managed to scrape together, that could have destroyed the breastwork trenches. That's the plan. Now, you've got to remember, at those days, this isn't the Somme trenches. This is 1915 trenches, so there's only a couple of lines at best. There's not a lot there, and a lot of them are just breastwork. Then they're thin defences. So what does the First Army get together? How many guns are we talking about?
Well, they managed to get together rather surreptitiously 282 field guns and howitzers, but they had an additional 36 heavier pieces. Now, think about this, Pete. That's amounting to 1 gun per 6 yards of front, which would rarely be equal throughout the rest of the war.
And that. Or even the great bombardment. So you've got to remember that that's even with later in the war, you've got separate trench systems to think about. So this is a super powerful effort. They've got all the ammunition they can get together. What have the Germans got? I expect they've got hundreds of guns in that 2,000 yards of front.
Do you know what, Pete? I don't know. I think they've got very few. I think it's about 24 field and 36 heavy guns.
Interesting, the balance of guns again there, showing the Germans have more heavy guns generally. It's interesting there. The British have 36 of the heavy guns are charged with dealing with the German guns, counter battery fire. This is nowhere near adequate, and the German heavy guns back on the Albers Ridge. They're not really taken into consideration. This battle's interesting for me tactically because it's the first one, isn't it, Gary? It's the first time you add the Royal Flying Corps aircraft to the traditional mix of infantry, cavalry, artillery, Royal Engineers, all the rest of it that's been there for eons.
We've done a podcast about the Royal Flying Corps in 1914. They were there, Pete. They've been there since the beginning of the war doing various tasks. But you're right, it's the first time that it's a considered addition. It's coming to a fruition. So the cameras are now allowing, in particular, well, you can listen to the 14 and 15 podcast really, but they get a photographic map which they use to produce a paper map for the whole of the area on a scale of 1 to 8,000. And this is a huge advance, and also they're helping with artillery observation. That's all we'll say, and this is crucial. And let's go on to how it's crucial. So very early on in the planning, you said Hague brings in experts. He brings in Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Trenchard. He's the commander of First Wing Royal Flying Corps. First Wing is First Armies. And they have a brief meeting on 16th of February, so a month before the attack in March. And I think I'm going to read this, and he's flattered, isn't he, Trenchard? So here we go. This is Trenchard. You can guess who Trenchard's going to be played by. Me!
This was the first time I'd ever seen Hague. I was very nervous beforehand, as I'd always heard that he was very reserved, austere, severe, and that he did not believe in a great deal in the air. He ordered me to go round to his headquarters about 5 o'clock in the evening and asked me about the use of aircraft in battle. I tried to explain what I thought they would do in future besides reconnaissance work. Machines would have to fight in the air against German machines, and how we should have to develop machine gun and bombs. He was interested. Then he said he was going to tell me something that only 3 or 4 people in the world yet knew. In March, somewhere in the vicinity of Merville and Neuve Chapelle, we were to launch an attack on the Germans. I was not to tell anybody. He asked, what will you be able to do? Oh, he was German. I explained rather badly about artillery observation reported to gun batteries by Morse and signal lamps and of our early effort to get wireless going. On the map I showed him the position of my squadrons and said what their several tasks could be. When I'd finished, he said, "Well, Trenchard, I shall expect you..." I can't change his accent how it started. "I shall expect you to tell me before the attack whether you can fly, because on your being able to observe for the artillery and carry out reconnaissance, the battle will partly depend. If you can't fly because of the weather, I shall probably put off the attack."
Right, several things. That was Trenchard quoting Hague. So you could have done it in the Trenchard voice, which is the same as every other officer's voice, I hasten to add. But no, you did it as a German.
It was a mistake.
Yes.
I've been reading social media. Apparently Hague wasn't nice. He was a butcher and a bungler, secretly German, and a lot of other things. What does Hague say about it in real life?
His account's somewhat different. General Sir Douglas Hague, HQ First Army. I told him the plan and asked for his proposals as to disposal of aeroplanes for reconnaissance and also for artillery observation.
That's not quite the same.
No, but a little bit later his actions showed he'd actually been listening and paying close attention, because on the 22nd of February he noted, "At 10 a.m. I motored to Merville and held conference there regarding plans for offensive. I went into the plans sent in at some length and insisted on the necessity of methodical preparation, and that every individual man should know exactly what his task was. Thanks to the wonderful map of enemy's trenches which we now had as a result of airplane reconnaissance, it was now possible to make our plans very carefully beforehand."
Now so it's a combination of flattering and showing an interest, but he is taking an interest, and in fact I would say that it's the start of a war-long association between the two. And as each is promoted, as Hague's promoted, Trenchard basically goes with him. It goes all the way through, because let's be honest, the RFC is the handmaiden, Gary, attending to its every needs of the artillery. You'd like a handmaiden? Well, you've got Janet. That'll do. Probably more than enough for you, especially at your time in life. Right, so Hague also is paying a lot of attention to the infantry assault. Obviously he is, because that's still at the centre of everything. The artillery will smash the way for the infantry, but the infantry have to do well as well. Careful briefing with these aerial photographs, sketch maps. What are they basically trying to do? So the infantry do what? So they know what? Well,
they know where they are and what and what lay ahead of them. It's almost like the role of cavalry, so that they're not going blindly into the German lines.
And what sort of preparations are they having to make? Is it just the infantry turn up and go over the top?
No, they've got to do things like improve the existing communication trenches, and they've got to dig specially constructed assembly trenches, because they've got to form up somewhere under cover, Peter, haven't they?
And that takes space, doesn't it? Because it's thousands. When thousands of men are going over, they need space. So it's a lot of digging. Now, the moment of attack is going to be 5 minutes past 8. But Hague he wants them to advance as quickly as possible to get the maximum benefit from the chaos and the destruction, panic caused by the bombardment. And as we mentioned, he's also going to rush forward machine guns and mountain guns to help sort of consolidate any anticipated gains. That's all. Consolidation is crucially important. Why is it crucially important against the Germans? What do the Germans always do?
Well, they always counterattack, don't they, Peter? At some point, you should expect a counterattack.
A local counterattack, and then a considered, unorganised counterattack by the reserves. So they're going to secure the German front line, and then they're going to go through the assault into the village of Neuve Chapelle, about 8:35, and then occupy an old line of British trenches named after someone very dear to your heart. Who was that?
They're known as the Janet Trenches.
Yeah, yes.
No, it's the Smith-Dorian line, Pete.
Oh, silly old me. So there's a lot of planning going on. Not everything works, but then does everything work in warfare, Gary? Does everything you plan go ahead according to it?
Well, does everything work in life, Pete? Never mind just war.
Not in mine.
No. Things are going quite well today because I've managed not to cue a song. So let's just look on the bright side.
Always look on the bright side of life. I can't whistle, Gary. I've done this. Right. So the barrage. What time does it start then?
It starts at 7:30 in the morning of the 10th of March 1915, which is my son's birthday.
Oh, how lovely. You like your son, don't you? Which son, by the way, John or Jack?
I'm not going to say on the basis that I may incriminate myself.
Right. Now, half the 18-pounders, they're thrashing the German barbed wire with shrapnel fire. Everybody else is combining to flay the German trenches. Now, let's have a look at a forward observation officer, and we're going to look at Second Lieutenant Charles Heath. He's with 2nd Siege Battery. What does he say about being in an OP post, observation post, in the front line during this bombardment, Gary?
I was posted to an observation post in a place called Port Arthur, a projection of the front line towards the German line. From there, you could see the German line very easily. We were very close to the German front line, under 100 yards. It was known that as soon as we started our bombardment of the German line, a number of shells would probably fall in our own lines. The captain, a very experienced man, told the major, who wasn't so experienced, that unless I had cover from behind, we'd all be soon killed by the shrapnel shells bursting short. He insisted that we get a fatigue party up from the battery a day or two before and build head cover over this little place with sandbags where I would be with my 2 signallers. Undoubtedly, his doing that saved our lives.
Now, the shrapnel fire had to work. It had to cut the barbed wire, didn't it? This is why they couldn't use high explosive. It would go up, and when it came down, it'd still be an obstacle. And now, this is 2nd Lieutenant John Wedderburn Maxwell, 5th Battery, 45th Brigade Royal Field Artillery. And he says, our guns were very close up because you wanted to have a flat trajectory to cut the wire. I was with the guns, first of all, very close up and very concerted all together, with another battery just over our heads and another battery just in front. A tremendous rate of fire. I should think probably 300 to 400 rounds a gun to blast the wire. Ooh.
So he hadn't been on the universal officer accent course yet?
No, he was a young lad. He would go and he'd get fully sorted out. Now, if you're aiming at the front wire, the front line, it's almost easier because they're just layered sandbags, muck, dirt, earth, and the high explosive. What effect do you think high explosive shells have on breastwork trenches?
Well, it basically blows it apart.
Ooh, that's what they'd meant it to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this barrage, by weight of shell per yard, this is the heaviest barrage that would be fired until 1917. Now, that's not my statistic. As you know, Gary, statistics are not my strong point. But that is a telling statistic. And if I was a good historian, I'd tell you where I got it from. But I can't remember.
Yeah, there are a number of things that are not your strong point, Pete.
Dates. Statistics.
Staying on track.
Well, I feel that you, Gary, may have led us off a little into my foibles. I like to call them foibles. What do
Anyway,
you call them?
this is Second Lieutenant Charles Heath again of the 2nd Siege Battery, and he says, "We were just north of the La Bassée Road, the right-hand area of where my battery was firing. They were firing to the north of that along the Boche front trench. That was where I was concerned in watching to see that no shell dropped back enough to hit our own lines. If that happened, I would send a correction down. Add 100 to the number 3 gun or number 4 gun and get up away from our own line and onto the Boche line. All along the line, the front line Germans were being bombarded to the left and the right of me."
So they do that, and then after 10 minutes, the field artillery moved to a barrage to a line east of Neuve Chapelle to prevent either escape or reinforcement by German reserves moving up. And what do the infantry think? They're watching this. I insist on a Scottish accent for this. This is somebody watching, and it's Lance Corporal William Andrews. Aye. 4th Black Watch, Borelli Brigade. So he's actually I want to make this clear, he's part of the 7th Meerut Division. They're the British battalion in the Indian Corps, or Indian division. So what does he say? What does William Andrews say?
He's Black Watch, so he's from Edinburgh.
Oh, so it's just the usual accent.
Yeah. "The noise almost split our numbed wits. As the shells went over our heads, we grew more and more excited. We could not hear each other. Shots from the 18-pounders were screaming not far over our heads, and much higher up, higher than the highest mountain of Europe, high explosives from the 15-inch howitzers were rushing like express trains. After a while, we could trace the different sounds. There was no difficulty in making out the German trenches. They had become long clouds of smoke and dust, flashing continuously with shell bursts and with enormous masses of trench material and bodies sounding high above the smoke cloud. The purely physical effect on us was one of extreme exhilaration. We could have laughed and cried with excitement. We thought that bombardment was winning the war before our eyes. Incredible that the men in the German front line could have escaped. We felt sure we were going to pour through the gap."
Now, in reality, not all the wire is cut, and actually to hit a narrow trench line is quite difficult. And always, I'd say they flatter to deceive, if you see what I mean. So it's not actually quite as bad as you think. Now, let's look at now we've managed to find a couple of Indian quotes from this, and these I'd like to reference now where we got them from. It's from the Battle of Neuve Chapelle, Britain's Forgotten Offensive of 1915. I'll guarantee now the publishers put that in, and this is by Paul Kendall. But we found a couple of quotes in there, and this is Subedar Kedar Singh Rawat of 2nd 39th Garhwal Rifles, Garhwal Brigade, Meerut Division, and he says this. I'm not going to do that awful Spike Milligan pretend Indian accent that they used to do. I'm just going to read it as straight as I can. "During our bombardment and the shelling of our position by the enemy, the Indian soldiers remained silently under cover. Suddenly the officer pocketed his voice. The 35 minutes had expired. That's how long the bombardment was. And he cried in English, waving his revolver. All orders are given to the natives in English. Advance! Like all the other native officers, he was a subedar, remember, I carried a rifle in addition to my revolver. At the order to advance, the men murmured the prayer, Jai Budra Nath Kejal. What does that mean, Gary?
I think it's you're going to go on to explain it, Pete, to be honest.
And repeated it as they emerged into the open. It is a supplication to the deity to this effect. I am fighting for my king. Surprised you didn't know that. Help me, and if possible, save my life. Sorry. Even the white officers, of whom there were two, the captain and lieutenant, paused to utter this prayer. That's quite nice. I like that.
Yeah, the reason I didn't explain it, Pete, is it would have taken something away from the quote.
I know. I just was being stupid. I do apologise. I apologise unreservedly.
Oh, I accept it magnanimously.
Oh, that's really good. It's as if we're getting on well. What happens, Gary, if the barbed wire isn't cut?
Well, because the infantry then get caught in the open, and as we mentioned before, they're going to come under machine gun fire and artillery fire. And there's that horrific term, isn't there, hanging on the old barbed wire, and that would come to have a terrible, terrible resonance.
It did. Now, the two battalions really suffer, and this is often all you ever seem to hear about in this battle. The 2nd Cameronians and the 2nd Middlesex Regiment. They're both in 23rd Brigade, 8th Division. Now, why do they suffer so badly, Gary? It's because two heavy howitzer batteries don't get into the line in time. They're held up by life, let's call it. The result is they really suffer badly. Now, this is Lieutenant Malcolm Kennedy of 2nd Cameronians, Scottish Rifles to you and me. As I say, 23rd Brigade. What does he say? What does Malcolm say?
Almost before I had time to realise it, I found myself up against the German wire. It was bared and twisted and almost unbroken, for the bombardment had proved ineffective at that particular point. Of how we got through that wire I have no clear idea. I have a vague recollection of tearing at it with my naked hands, and with the help of one of my corporals, dragging away the remains of a chevaux de frise, while a German fired at us at a range of only 4 or 5 yards, and misses us both. After that the fellow must have bolted, as I remember throwing myself through the remaining strands of wire.
That's a nice quote, a nice accent as well.
The chevaux de frise are a sort of portable barrier, isn't it? It's often spikes and wrapped in barbed wire and stuff like that.
That's it. Now, another quote comes from Sergeant William Siddons of the 2nd Middlesex Regiment, same brigade. And he says, Middlesex, right, Cockney. Oh, God. You should have done this one.
Just listen to me.
No, that's Australia. Oh, I'm just going to read it straight. The fighting at Clark's Quarters, that's Australia, was terrific. Our men fought like demons, possessed, and they were met by a determined enemy. But our bombardment had shattered the nerves of many of them, and we gave them a real taste of what can be done by roused British soldiers. Crikey. Of course, we lost a great many men, but the slaughter amongst the Germans was awful. The enemy's trenches presented a horrible spectacle, and dead and dying men lay all around us. Now, the thing is, they had it really tough, those battalions, and a lot of books concentrate on them. But in actual fact, most of it went well. 5 of the 8 assault battalions took their objectives, and they advanced some 1,200 yards with minimal... What's that in metres, Gary?
It's about 1,100.
I think there were minimal losses, and they take Neuve Chapelle, and they take... What else do they take, Gary?
They take the Smith-Dorrien line. I mean, they probably achieved...
Is that useful?
Yeah, I mean, they probably achieved the majority of their tactical objectives, but strategically it's not that useful.
I'm not sure if they're both tactical, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about their strategic objective, as stated earlier, is taking the Ober's
I think that's
ridge.
A tactical objective as well.
Well, I disagree with you. Now, this is Private H. Mackin of the 2nd Lincolnshire Regiment, 25th Brigade, 8th Division. I had no idea what accent they have in Lincolnshire. With bayonets fixed, the air company of our battalion rushed across 80 yards of open ground to the first German trench. They were
Lancashire, apparently.
Yeah, they were so thinned as scarcely to maintain the combat when they got there. Our Company B quickly followed, and the Germans, overwhelmed, fled. We passed the first German trench full of wounded and dead, ours and the enemy's. The enemy had no time to occupy the second trench, and we rushed them beyond the third, which last we occupied. No sooner had we stationed ourselves than the Irish rifles scrambled over us and gave further pursuit.
Now, that means they'd taken the Neuve Chapelle and the Smith-Dorrien line. That was flooded. They got them by 9 o'clock. So, this is quick progress. Now, this is Private A. Allen of the 2nd Lincolnshire Regiment, 25th Brigade. And I'm afraid this is reprehensible. No funny accents, because this is terrible behaviour. There are reasons for it, but it's not an excuse. And Allen says this: whenever we got amongst them, they held up their hands and cried out in English, "Mercy, mercy," with yells of "Mons" and "Scarborough." That's because of the German bombardment just a week or two before, well, a month or two before. However, our boys rushed into them, and the slaughter only ceased when the order was given to take them prisoner. Over 300 Germans were captured at this point. But before that, they'd been killing them out of hand. This is not on, really. And there's generally terrible scenes in the German trenches. And you've got a description from Rifleman Amar Singh Rawat. Again, 2nd 39th Garhwal Rifles. Another Sikh, I think you said off tape he was. Yeah. So what did he say?
So many men were killed and wounded that they could not be counted. And of the Germans, the number of casualties is beyond calculation. When we reached their trenches, we used the bayonet and the kukri, and blood was shed so freely that we could not recognise each other's faces. The whole ground was covered with blood. There were heaps of men's heads, and some soldiers were without legs, others had been cut in two, some without hands, and others without eyes. The scene was indescribable. If I get killed, it does not matter. When so many of my brethren have been slain, it would not matter about me.
Wow. So that's a combined effect of the bayonet, the kukri, and of course most of the damage would have been done by the artillery. Now, they'd broken the line altogether on a 4,000-yard front, which seems different from the 2,000-yard.
At the start, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll glide past that. From Moated Grange to in the north, and if you look on your map, you'll see that, to the Port Arthur salient, where they had trouble, by the way. But never mind, we haven't got time for detail. By 10 o'clock, they'd got the village of Neuve Chapelle. They got 1,200 yards, and they gained the Smith-Dorrien line. So all that was in thing. Now, a lot of the battalions are almost unscathed. And what had been demonstrated is that their tactics could break the German lines. Now, what's the remaining question, though, Gary? What... for you, the strategic, for me, the higher tactical objective. What hasn't been decided?
Well, could they break through to the uplands of the Obers Ridge and beyond?
Uplands? Have you been there?
Yes, it's a pimple, isn't it?
Well, it's a sort of low pimple, yes. It's a stretch. It's the sort of thing you drive over and don't notice. Oops. Now,
but it is the heights in the area. That's the point.
It is. From there, you can see down and you can see what's happening. It's relative height, isn't it? So I'm relatively taller than you.
You are relatively.
Now, then things start to go wrong. Now, why does it go wrong? Well, let's do our brainstorming. So give me a reason. What's going wrong?
Well, they've got to winkle out pockets of German resistance because they don't just all give up, and it's proving difficult to organise and actually very costly. In particular, the 200 yards of trench known as Port Arthur was causing a huge delay to the Indian Corps, as you mentioned earlier.
All right. Now I mentioned the Smith-Dorrien line was waterlogged. Would that be?
Well, you can't use it then, can you? Just can't be used. Yeah, it can't be. It's no good.
So you've got to dig a new one. All a matter. Do you think the troops had maintained their order amidst all this fighting, slaughter, and the rest of it?
No, they're going to be in a state of total confusion, aren't they? They're not used to the headlong stresses of combat, and a lot of them are not going to be capable of thinking clearly. The officers are well briefed, but are the men? And
of course, what could have happened to the officers and NCOs?
Well, as I mentioned, they've been well briefed, but once you start taking casualties, and the casualties were severe, it could leave an NCO in command, and with very little clue as to what was meant to be happening.
And the NCOs could get killed as well, of course. Yeah. So everybody's a bit. It's going to. What about communications? I presume they were able to report easily back to headquarters what was happening, exactly what was happening. Would that be the case?
Well, you've got to think about what the Germans are doing. So the communications, in essence, fall apart under German shell fire, and this is despite the best efforts to bury the telephone lines. Rawlinson had practically no idea at all of what was happening.
He was in charge of 4th Corps, and Hague presumably the same, and Wilcox, the Indian Corps commander. Now, just as an idea, this is a quote from 2nd Lieutenant John Wedderburn Maxwell again, and he's sent forward to join the infantry in a forward OP, a makeshift forward OP, and this gives an idea of what it's like. This is John Wedderburn Maxwell. Tim Thackeray said, "You've got to go up. Dotty has been killed." Dutty Donaldson, the old dugout, a dear old boy, he was killed. I had to go up and take his place with the infantry, both supporting them with the fire they wanted, protecting them against the German counterattacks, and seeing what was happening on the rest of the front. I went up. It was rather difficult. You can imagine the place was quite devastated, firing going on all around, some rifle fire, a great deal of machine gun fire. All I had to go on with was a signaller who'd just come back to help guide me to where he'd been. I wanted to pick up the story from the infantry you found yourself among, and it wasn't a very wholesome place. I was sitting just like we are here, and all of a sudden my little signaller boy, very young, about my age, 20, he was suddenly flat, dead. You couldn't dig in. They had these silly little entrenching tools, but you couldn't dig a good deal of earth in front of you to protect you from a rifle bullet. I moved along the front and met a great friend from the 3rd Battery called Alan Hornby. He was at the shop with me. That means, I forgot Woolwich. Woolwich. With me. Alan and I sat down and watched these heavy shells coming over from the Germans. I'd woken up then to the fact that this was a very serious business. You had these things coming.
You'd hear that coming.
You saw a black thing hurtle to the ground and then a huge flame of black smoke, the height of these trees. Later I was up with the Jocks, the Cameronians. We repelled several counterattacks with SOS fire. Every time our infantry moved forward, you had to adjust your SOS protection. I was doing the work for 6 guns. The Jocks found the Germans killing their prisoners or something. Anyway, they absolutely got their wreck out, and I know they really murdered everything they could get hold of. It was very savage. So even amidst, it's just chaos. There's people misbehaving, there's death and mayhem all around. Nobody knows what's happening. The communications have gone. Command and control has gone. And that when you were in the army, you know what's important. Command and control at all times.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that Lieutenant Normal Donaldson, Dotty, the old boy that was mentioned at the start of that, he was just 36 years old, Pete.
That's half my age. Yes, right. Now, so what confusion means delay, and delay minutes turn into hours. And you've got Generals Wilcox in your corps, Rawlinson, 4th Corps. They're struggling to get a grip on the situation, aren't they? And what does that mean? What does the fact they don't know what's happening? They can't control the infantry. They can't control the guns. What does that mean for the next stage of the advance?
Well, they can't order the next stage of the advance until they know that all the original objectives have been secured. And every minute that passes is exploited by the Germans to reorganise and move up their reserves, making it much more difficult.
Them Germans. And you're going to be... you could say this using your German experience.
Or reading it. Weissfeldwebel.
That's very good. Who is he?
Weissfeldwebel Brockman of the 15th Infantry Regiment. And
he's German.
He's German. And he says, shells were landing with an extraordinary racket on the village. Alarm! Alarm! The Tommies had launched an attack. Everyone was gathered together, including the sick. Then we forced marched to brigade headquarters. The field kitchens arrived, steaming away. So food and iron rations were distributed. Everyone ate his fill and crammed his pouches to capacity. We topped up with ammunition from an ammunition wagon and set off, commanded by Major Strippelman, with each man carrying 2 extra belts of ammunition round his neck and singing, "We're not afraid, of the thunder of the guns." Yes. We came under shell fire at Hurley's for the first time, and from then on, it was bloody awkward. Towards the close of day, we arrived. Accompanied by the crack of bullets and casualties everywhere, night fell. At the entrance to the village, near the Lees Brook, we dug in, a mere 100 metres from a farm occupied by the Tommies. The road was barricaded, whilst off to the left, 2nd Company also dug in. Each man dug a small trench as best he could. Now, he worked in London for a period before the war, about 2 or 3 years.
So he just had a little tinge.
So he had a little tinge of a German accent, yes.
Now, both Gary and I would like to, again, pay tribute to where we got these quotes from. And this is from Jack Sheldon, one of our best chums. And this is from the German Army on the Western Front, 1915. Jack Sheldon is... he's like a sort of saint for historians, because all us historians who can't read German, he provides the raw material for and spoon feeds it to us.
He does all the hard work, doesn't he? And he's done an awful lot of it.
He's great. So buy his books, support his burgeoning career. Right now, so what does it mean if the whole point about the Neuve Chapelle was it was a narrow front attack? Now, what's the problem with a narrow front attack, Gary?
Well, because it's so narrow, the Germans can actually plug the gaps that you're creating.
So, like the boy with a dike?
Yeah, or me at that museum where I put my finger in the hole in the side of the boat.
I'll put that picture up. It's always a favourite. Yes, I think you were there demonstrating why that boat had sunk and others hadn't. Yes, if it's a narrow gap, then it's easy to plug. So what do? Overnight, they dig a new defence line. They bring up the infantry. We've just heard one quote from them. And what else do they bring up?
Well, they bring up more artillery batteries.
And what dominates a battlefield?
Artillery.
So now over the net, we're cutting out the story in a sense now. The renewed British attacks are made, but the impetus has gone. The Germans have closed the gap, and any more advances? Not really. Do you think, Gary? What do you think?
No, I mean they're pretty much the main concentration then is defending what they had from the German counterattacks.
Right. Now this is the next quote is again from
Weissfeldwebel.
Brockman, and so tell us about this. That they're just about to attack, and then it's cancer, all sorts of things going on. So tell us what happens.
When it became light, a hellish rate of fire began. However, it cannot be compared with that which we experienced later on the Somme or at Chavignon. One sulphur shell after another sent pillars of yellow smoke skywards. In between, incendiary rounds smashed down, covering the area with black clouds, and over it all came the sound of machine guns firing. A row of burning houses cast a flickering light over everything, casting an image which was at the same time both fascinating and appalling. Over our heads at one point circled a German airman. It was Lieutenant Max Immelmann, the Eagle of Lille. Hang on, how does he know that?
Yeah, he must have had a big thing.
He must have had a big sign. Yeah. It was Lieutenant Max Immelmann, the Eagle of Lille, who was surrounded by white clouds of bursting shrapnel. The enemy launched attacks several times, but wherever their lines appeared, we shot them up. A number of Tommies tried to take cover behind this wall. Very quickly it was holed like a sieve. Our ranks were thinned too. Bavarians, Hessians and Saxons came pouring in during the night. The plan was to assault Neuve Chapelle in the early dawn, but our company was scattered to the four winds and torn apart.
Now what's happening is they're trying to counterattack. They make some local counterattacks, but when the main reserves, the Bavarians, Hessians and Saxons, when they arrive, they don't. They're held. They can't get it together. So they cannot take back Neuve Chapelle. But can the British take Ober's Ridge?
No.
So that's
and
gone.
Even if they had, the Germans would have kicked them off, wouldn't they?
I think so. I do actually, because they would have had 3. What was it you said? 5 kilometres.
4 kilometres.
4 kilometres behind. What's the cost?
By the time the battle was over, the First Army suffered 11,652 casualties, and the German casualties are estimated to be about 8,000.
Yeah, I think that figure's probably. I don't think people really know. Now, is it a success, Gary?
Well, Neuve Chapelle was a failure, isn't it? Because you've not attained the objectives that were declared.
The main objective is Ober's Ridge, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got the battered remnants of Neuve Chapelle, and you've straightened out a minor salient, but it's not worth that cost, Pete. Surely.
11,652 casualties. There must be 3,000 or 4,000 dead in that. Yeah, no, I think, no. Was success that likely? A major success, taking Aber's Ridge. Was that likely?
You mentioned at the start it was the first assault against prepared defences that the BEF had made against the Germans. You've got the greenness, if you pardon the expression, of almost everyone involved in the offensive.
So everyone's learning, are they?
Yeah, it's entirely new for the BEF, and I mean everybody benefits from the experience, but it's quite a costly experience.
What about the dead?
I said, except it's quite a costly experience. Had you not interrupted, Pete?
I apologise unreservedly again.
I accept magnanimously again.
Oh, we're doing really well at this, being polite to each other, what we talked about earlier. What's happening? We're learning. What we learned, well, Hague is defining almost the basic features of the British offensive for the rest of the war. And that, in turn, is based on the French experience, isn't it? It's a remarkable start, isn't it, guys?
Yeah, but that's not saying that it was perfect, are we? We're not saying that at all.
No. But he's using innovatory techniques, bringing in... and the tactics are fit for purpose in the sense of they can take the German front line. If they've got a front line and just a weak support trench and not much artillery support, we can take it. Is it going to stay like that, Gary?
No, but it's a good start, Pete, and it was good for that time.
I think so. The biggest problem for any aims of doing more is the problems in command and control. They just don't know what's happening, and therefore the whole thing falls apart after about 9 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning. Now, after the battle, do you think they learn from it? Well, all the generals are thinking, and one of them is Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson. Now, he tries to put down what he thinks, and it's got a term in it that is going to resonate. What does he say, Gary?
What we want to do now is what I call bite and hold. Bite off a piece of the enemy's line, like Neuve Chapelle, and hold it against counterattack. The bite can be made without much loss, and if we choose the right place and make every preparation to put it quickly in a state of defence, there ought to be no difficulty in holding it against the enemy's counterattacks, and inflicting on him at least twice the loss that we have suffered in making the bite.
Now, this is something that people will always say, oh, but in 1950, why couldn't Hague understand bite and hold? Well, two things about this. Bite and hold isn't really the answer. The answer is the all-arms battle. And the second thing, well, you tell me, why can't the British BEF do it, Gary?
Well,
why?
You haven't got the artillery, and you definitely in 1915 haven't got the shells to make bite and hold a feasible operational methodology. It just wouldn't be practical because you just couldn't do it.
So it's like wanting to say a crossrail across London without having put in the logistical structure and the planning,
or having the money.
Yes, that would be it, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
In other words, because you want to do something doesn't mean you can. And there was another problem, and that's almost a political problem, isn't it?
Well, it was too slow, wasn't it? It wouldn't meet the political requirements that are imposed on Sir John French and frankly his ultimate master, Joffre.
Yeah, because although Joffre wasn't in command, he was in control, if you like. Or is it the other way around? No. Anyway, Joffre is the ultimate commander-in-chief, really, on the West Front. He's not a supreme commander, but he does have more influence by far. After the battle, it was decided the frontage is too narrow. Why is it? I mean, because surely that was the reason they could get that barrage together, was that it was only a narrow frontage. But what's the problem with a narrow frontage? And we have talked about this before.
We mentioned it. The gap created was far too easily plugged by the Germans.
And they could shoot in from either side, is the other point which I often raise. If it's a narrow gap attack, then on the edges, they could all the units on the side. So what happens for the rest of 1915 then?
Well, the British generals are constantly trying to widen the front attacked, but they haven't got the artillery and the shells needed to have any real chance of success. So,
So as they widen it, they need to get the same number of shells on each square yard of trench. They need
more guns and more shells.
But they were using, you said, all their guns.
Yeah.
And they haven't got any shells.
Yeah, and what happens then if the Germans dig new lines, new trench systems, new redoubts, new belts of wire? What's going to happen?
Life can only get worse, Gary. As I said to you when we started these podcasts. Gary, I said, life can only get worse. Was I right?
You were, and for a lot of men, it got a lot shorter too. Now,
Yeah.
with your permission, Pete, I'm going to finish with a poem that I found in Battle Lines, the Battles of French Flanders by John Cooksey and Jerry Merland. Now, this is a poem written in 1919 by a chap called Heathcote William Garrard, and it was published as a brief poem entitled Epitaph Neuve Chapelle in his book Worms and Epitaphs, which I believe you bought.
Oh, I have.
At great expense. Now, this poem is described as clearly echoing Simonides' epitaph from the Spartan dead at Thermopylae and Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. So it's a huge build-up. And here's the poem. Tell them at home there's nothing here to hide. We took our orders, asked no questions, died.
I do like this chap. When it comes to poetry, he cracks on with it, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's the sort of poetry we like, isn't it? Well, thanks, Peter. That was, as I said to you before, I didn't know a great deal about Neuve Chapelle beforehand, and I still don't. But thank you for trying.
You've shared your ignorance, haven't you?
Yes, widely.
Oh, whoa. All right. Cheers, Gary. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Pete.